And we've got most of our kids are gone, so we're going to go ahead and just stay out here for Sunday school, and so we'll just have one big Sunday school class today, okay? I've had a few thoughts on what to do for Sunday school, and Here the other day, we started a little bit of a lesson, and we really said it wasn't even a sermon; it was more of a lesson, right? And we talked about the Reformers and how that so many people in Christianity today lift up the Reformers, and I'm surprised at how many Baptists actually try to lift up the Reformers. And we talked a little bit about why that Luther wouldn't have liked us very much, and we talked about why John Calvin wouldn't have liked us very much, and we've spent a little bit of time, I would say, within I'm going to use it this way, the Christian realm, talking about how that we as Baptists have some distinctives that set us apart from the Protestants and from Catholicism, and so we just kind of talked a little bit about that, and we really didn't spend a lot of time talking about necessarily Baptist doctrine. We kind of mentioned what some of those distinctives are. And we really spent our time talking about what is it that Luther believed and what is it that John Calvin believed, and some of the comments that both of those guys made about people like us. Well, today I'm going to branch off from that quite a bit, and it's different. I'm going to step outside of the quote-unquote Christian realm, and we're going to talk a little bit about paganism and the difference that we have with so much of what I'm going to call modern spirituality. And it's interesting, if you study modern paganism at all, if you've read anything about it, you'll understand there's a whole lot of talk about spiritual things and the spiritual nature and spirituality, and they leave off talking about, obviously they don't believe in Jesus Christ and Him crucified and the payment of sins and things like that, right? But they do believe in spirituality. They do believe in the spiritual things. And it's kind of scary when you get in and start to look at some of this stuff. I've been watching a little bit of some of the trends in our culture here in the U.S., and more and more you see what I would define as paganism starting to take over. There is an idea of people want to reject Jesus Christ, but yet they also still have an inward need for some kind of spirituality. And so they're starting to tap into a lot more and more. They're tapping into what might be defined as New Age. They're tapping into witchcraft. We think about that as something that's registered or something that's relegated to the movies, right? We think about witches and wizards and well, that's something in the movies. But actually, if you pay any attention at all, it's becoming more and more common for people in the U.S. to actually practice witchcraft. Now, it may not be like you think about in the movies so much, the guy dressing in the long robe and carrying the thing and shooting lightning out of the end of his staff and things like that. But listen, there is actually a lot of more and more. There is a lot of people that practice witchcraft. It starts to show up in a lot of different ways. But you may not actually hear it referred to as witchcraft. You might hear Wicca or things along those lines and different things like that. And so there's a lot of different stuff. And so when you talk about paganism, there's a lot of different things that come into that. It's not just simply one thing, right? Paganism really kind of incorporates a whole lot of different things. It may be anything from like I talked about, witchcraft, or it could be New Age stuff. It could be just worshiping nature. There's a whole lot of different things that are wrapped up in that. Now, there's a couple scriptures that I want to read, and then we're going to kind of get into a few things as we go through this. I do want to tell you, though, before I get started, a little bit of what has kind of maybe started me down this path a little bit on wanting to bring a lesson or two on this. It's probably been a month or so ago, I actually heard a radio program where the lady got to talking about how she had this deep feeling of needing spirituality, and so she didn't want to get into Christianity because she didn't think much of that, and so she started looking at witchcraft. Listen, this is a mainstream radio program. This is not like some late night, cuckoos that are on at midnight when nobody else is awake and moving. This is mainstream, middle of the day. It was NPR. They were running a regular broadcast on different things. They were covering, I think, spirituality and religion. And this is one of the articles that or one of the programs that they were running. You look at that, and you look at other things too. I mean, more and more, as you start to look at, even honestly, you go to different malls, different places, and invariably, lots of times, you're going to find a store that is selling, among other things, they're going to have stones that you can hang around your neck. They're going to have different kinds of incense. They're going to have astrology charts. They're going to have the different phases of the moon, and they're going to have all kinds of these things, right? That in and of themselves on the surface some of them look harmless, but they're not. As you start to dig into some of this, you're going to see pretty quickly that there is a reason some of that stuff is hanging in that shop. I've also noticed here recently, even on just a radio broadcast, not a radio broadcast, but when you look at some of the commercials. So you heard me talk about one of the radio programs on NPR, right? And it was talking about witchcraft, and like it was talking about, it's like a common thing. Like, hey, who doesn't do this? But then you you say, well, that's a liberal radio station. Well, okay, well, let's talk about 97.1, right? 97.1 Talk around here. This is a very conservative radio station. But you know what? One of the most common commercials that they have played is about the Mystic Attic. And it's this commercial about the store here locally that, do you need enchantments? Do you need stones to carry around your neck? Do you need this to protect you from that? I think you would be surprised to realize how much worshiping of false gods, worshiping of nature, worshiping witchcraft, I think you would actually be surprised at how much it has actually came into popularity in the U.S. And I'm not just talking about in movies and books and things like that, but literally people that you probably come in contact in a day that seem pretty normal may identify themselves as being part of the Wicca group, which is witchcraft, or they may practice what the Bible referred to as curious arts or necromancy, or listen, those are terms that even the Bible used and had a lot to say about. And I think it's interesting and scary that as you look at more and more people that have been coming up through the generations in the U.S., and more, especially newer generations, they are forsaking going to church. They're forsaking things. And listen, we can talk about why that's happening. As you look at what should be good, solid Bible Baptist preaching, how many of those churches have split up over arguments that really have nothing to do with Christianity? How much inward fighting goes on? or as you look at the different denominations, and Baptists aren't immune from this. The covering up of sexual immorality, the covering up of child abuse, and all kinds of different things, right? Listen, that has driven people away because they look at that stuff and they think, well, if that's all that the Bible brings, if that's all that Christianity brings, who needs that? Listen, the problem with all of those things that I just described, those things are not biblical. Those things shouldn't be in the body of Christ. Those things are there because the many churches are full of lost people. Or it's because people have not followed the very teachings that are in the Bible. But it's not just that. Listen, we've been told from the beginning of Jesus Christ's ministry that this world would hate His message. We shouldn't be surprised that as time goes on, listen, we had a time period where we had peace. We had a time period where we had freedom of religion. And you know what mankind does with the concept of freedom of religion? He eventually forsakes the things of Christ, and he starts to take on all of those other things. Because you know what? In the heart of man, if man has not been reborn, if man has not been bought and paid for by the blood of Jesus Christ, if he isn't a new creature, well, he really doesn't want the things of God. He really doesn't want the message of Jesus Christ. But yet, within mankind, even though atheists would try to tell you otherwise, listen, within the nature of mankind is a certain knowledge that there is something greater than him. And within mankind is a desire to worship something. Even atheists, if they're honest with themselves, which they're not, they worship science or they worship man. There is a belief system within atheism. And so, as we think about people that have forsaken the teachings of the Bible, generally you're going to find they fall into two categories. They're going to fall into atheism, or they're going to start to fall into they need something spiritual, and they want something spiritual. They just don't want God. They don't want the Bible. They don't want it that way, right? And yesterday, me and Tanya were talking, and this really was the final straw, so to speak, that kind of pushed me into taking some of the things that I had been looking at and some of the things I'd been doing and making that decision to talk about this a little bit, is the influence that paganism is starting to have in the U.S. I say starting, it's been going on for decades now, but it's becoming more and more popular. Listen, somebody that I grew up with, somebody who sat under some of the same teachings and preachings that I did, posted on Facebook about how that they went to a winter solstice festival and how they were able to celebrate the winter solstice, and they talked about how that they got to burn the Yule log, and how they got to take the stones and cast the stones down. And basically, I'm not going to get into it too much, but it's the idea almost of, really it's very similar to like a tarot card where you're trying to read people's future, but there's this idea of depending on how the stones fall or what the stones say is going to say, you know, how your upcoming year is going to be. That type of stuff is no longer just something that you see in the movies. Listen, people are actually starting to practice those things. I say starting, again, this has been going on for decades. It's been going on for a long time. But what's starting to happen is that it's becoming mainstream. And if you don't think so, do a Google search and ask the question, is paganism growing in the United States? And do you know what you're going to find? You're going to find articles from the National Geographic. You're going to find articles from the New York Times. You're going to find articles from major leading news industries. We're not talking about some back dark room article. We're talking about mainstream news, CNN, CBS. Listen, a simple Google search about how much paganism is growing has hit all of those mainstream media outlets multiple times. Often, by the way, in a very positive light. They're not talking about, oh, how horrible it is that this is growing. They're talking about how great it is. I'm going to read to you a little bit out of Deuteronomy chapter 18. Deuteronomy chapter 18, starting in verse 9. This is when Moses is talking to the children of Israel as they're going to go into the promised land. And he tells them in verse 9, "When thou art come into the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee, thou shalt not learn to do after the abominations of those nations. There shall not be found among you any one that maketh his son or his daughter to pass through the fire, or that uses divination, or an observer of times, or an enchanter, or a witch, or a charmer, or a consulter with familiar spirits, or a wizard, or a necromancer. For all that do these things are an abomination unto the Lord, and because of these abominations the Lord thy God doth drive them out from before thee. Thou shalt be perfect with the Lord thy God. For these nations which thou shalt possess hearkened unto observer of times, unto diviners. But as for thee, the Lord thy God hath not suffered thee so to do." He just listed out so many things that are becoming more and more and more popular today. These are things that have been around for thousands of years. Do you know how people that worship some of these things declare? They will say, well, our religion is pre-Christianity. They're telling you, hey, we existed before Christianity did. Oh, these things are just coming back. There was one article that actually talked about how that what's happening is that Christianity drove out paganism in the Roman religion, but it never really got rid of it, and it's all been under the surface. And what's happening is now we're seeing a shift back to paganism. As Christianity falls out of popularity, we're just turning back to what we used to be, is what people are saying. This is not me saying this. This is not even Christians saying this. These are mainstream New York Times, National Geographic type articles that are saying stuff like this. I want to read something to you. Man, there's just so much here. This is actually this is an article in the New York Times. And the title of it, listen to this title. The Return of Paganism. It says, maybe there actually is a genuinely post-Christian future for America. This is not talking about this in a negative light. This is almost said in a way of hope. Maybe there is a post-Christian opportunity in America. He goes on to talk a little bit about how that so much is changing, and that we really have this potential for a post-Christian future. He says, this is why I've lately become interested in books and arguments that suggest there actually is or might be a genuinely post-Christian future for America, and that the term paganism might reasonably be reasonably revived to describe the new American religion currently struggling to be born. A fascinating version of this argument is put forward by Stephen D. Smith, a law professor at the University of San Diego, in his book, Pagans and Christians in the City, Culture Wars from the Tiber to the Potomac. Smith argues that much of what we understand as the march of secularism is something of an illusion, and that behind the scenes, what's actually happening is the modern culture war is the return of pagan religious conception, which was half buried, though never fully so, by the rise of Christianity. What is the conception? Simply this, that divinity is fundamentally inside the world rather than outside it, that God or the gods or being are ultimately part of nature rather than an external creator, and that the meaning and morality and metaphysical experiences are so to be sought in a fuller communion with the immanent world rather than a leap toward the transcendent. This paganism is not materialistic or atheistic. It allows for belief in spiritual and supernatural realities. It even accepts the possibility of an afterlife, but is deliberately agnostic about final things, what awaits beyond the shores of this world, and it's skeptical of the idea that there exists some ascetic, world-denying moral standard to which we should aspire. This is a New York Times article from 2018. There's another one in New York Times from 2023 that talks about how that there's this new debate going on about whether or not what we are in today is the death of Christianity, that we are seeing Christianity come to its end, and we're in the early days of seeing paganism being reborn. Both of these articles, by the way, not Christian writers, not pro-Christian people. Both of these articles talk about the fact that paganism was never truly lost, that it's been buried in Christianity the entire time. Man, there is just a ton of this stuff. I remember even early in my life were the only people that talked about the dangers of accepting paganism into the Christian practices were people that were ultra-conservative Christians, and everybody else mocked them. But listen, it is quickly becoming the other way around. Christianity is no longer talking about paganism being buried within Christianity. It's the pagans that are talking about that. I think about, and listen, I'll be honest, I have and I've watched a lot of these movies myself. But I really wonder about the wisdom of some of the popular movies that we watch. Let me take it this way. Let me say, I wonder about the wisdom of watching some of the movies that have been popular over the last few decades. We often excuse ourselves and say, well, it's just simply, it's entertainment. It's entertainment. It's okay. We know it's not real. But you think about things like Star Wars. Listen, I've watched every Star Wars movie there is. But you know what? What you see in Star Wars? Star Wars is actually preaching New Age religion. This idea of there being this force that runs throughout all nature, and that you got to tap into the good force or the bad force. You know what really turned me off to Star Wars? The more I realized how much it's preaching religion. But you know, there was actually one Star Wars where they actually talked about that this person was, who was their father? Well, they didn't have a father. There was no father. This person was just born. That they were so full of the Force, they were just born. That's blasphemy. That's blasphemy. Because there's only one person that was ever virgin born. That's Jesus Christ. Well, let's step away from that for a little bit. Let's talk about Marvel. You know what Marvel's full of? Marvel is actually full of Greek and Norse mythology. We think about Thor in the Marvel movies as being this fictional character that's in these movies. But listen, people actually worshipped Thor and Odin. You go back and study the Scandinavian history, those people worshipped Thor. They worshipped Odin. They worshipped Loki. They believed them to be actual gods. You know what some of those movies have done? They've repopularized those characters. And you say, well, that's goofy. Yeah? You go do some internet searches and you are going to find that the number of Thor worshipers is actually increasing in the last decade. You know, there's another common theme that you see in the Marvel movies. I mentioned what happened in Star Wars. In one of the Marvel movies, you know what happened? They put together their combined genius, they took this stone, and they built a new character. When that new character came to life, do you know how he described himself? He said, I am. Who are you? And he said, I am. That's blasphemy. You know who the I am is? The I am is God. That's blasphemy. We sometimes take these things and we say, well, it's just entertainment. But yet then we're surprised when in 2023, a mainstream article, a mainstream thing like the New York Times is writing about how popular paganism is becoming, and that the younger generation are turning to paganism more and more and more. They're getting into Wicca, and they're getting into New Age, and they're getting into all of this stuff. Nature worship, worshiping the earth. You say, well, they don't really worship. Yes, they do. Yes, they do. They absolutely worship the earth. A lot of those things, even though they're very different, you can look at some of the witchcraft that's going on. You can look at some of the worshiping of old gods. You can look at New Age stuff. You know what? A lot of that has something very much in common. It worships the earth. It worships the things of this earth. You know, God said that those things are an abomination. God hates those things. And yet, unfortunately, so much today, Christians just take those things and, well, it's entertainment. It's okay, it's entertainment. Or, well, we've whitewashed those things to be something else now, and it's okay. I'm not sure that you can do that with something that God says He hates. Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, Harry Potter. Listen, you look over the last decade or two, and what have been the most popular movies? Things that lift up witchcraft and wizards and spells and enchantments, right? Even Marvel. I didn't even talk about the fact that who is Wanda in Marvel? She's the Scarlet Witch. She's the most powerful witch there is. You look at the Lord of the Rings stuff, and they talk about necromancers and communicating with the dead. That is what Deuteronomy was talking about. It said God hates that stuff. It's an abomination. And yet we're surprised that we've accepted all of this stuff and we've let it become part of our culture as entertainment, and we've accepted it, and then we're shocked that according to some of these research that I've done, paganism, the number of people that identify as pagans is basically doubling year after year. Some of these numbers indicate, and this is just people that have been surveyed and have made that final step of officially declaring themselves to be pagans. The number in the U.S. is pushing close to 2 million people that openly declare themselves to be pagans. It's kind of scary. You know, I read 2 different articles, from 2 different writers who both described that the time we're in, and I mentioned this earlier, that the time we're in, they believe, is that we are seeing the death of Christianity and the rebirth of paganism. That's what this world thinks. You know, and I don't have time to get into all this. We'll see if we do another lesson on this or not. But I got to thinking about it. And you know, these articles, both of them referred to the fact that Christianity tried to wipe out paganism, but that paganism was really never done away with. And it's not, when you read it in context, it's not talking about that paganism was still hidden and it was being done in secret somewhere. It was talking about that in a lot of denominations, they actually incorporated paganism into their practices. Therefore, it was never fully done away with. You should, if you haven't studied this before, you should study the history of what Catholicism did when it would go into a new country. You know, Catholicism has a long history, a very long history, of taking things and incorporating them into their doctrine and into their tradition as a way of making it easier for people with a different background to be able to accept Catholicism. They've done it for centuries. You read how the Catholic missionaries would go into a place that was maybe had a Celtic background, and how they would take some of the festivals and the practices that the Celtics did, and they would basically change them around a little bit and say, well, now you can see how that this is Christian. And it's okay to do this because this is Christian. And it made it, what it did is it made it, when they would come in and they would force these people to move over to Catholicism, because make no mistake, oftentimes Catholicism, the way it spread was by domination. It made it easier for people to incorporate their existing practices into Catholicism. And it made it easier for them to be willing to take on the mantle of Catholicism. This is not me saying this. You study Catholic history, it's pretty clear. And so we shouldn't be surprised that as Christianity starts to become unpopular, so to speak, that what starts to happen is people start to look back to other things. And you know what they do? There are people that were raised Christian or their families were Christian, but they've got to studying their Celtic history, and they get intrigued with the Celtic history and what were the Celtics like before. Or, listen, there's a lot of TV shows that one of the articles talked about. There's a TV show that deals with the Vikings, and it's really popularized the Vikings, and people are starting to go back and to research what the Vikings believed and how the Vikings lived. And you know what's happening? People are starting to be drawn to Viking religious beliefs. We as Christians cannot accept those things. We as Christians need to stand firm for the things of the Bible. We need to stand firm for the things of Jesus Christ. And most importantly, we need to be out there telling the old story that we sang about before Sunday school. We need to be out there preaching Jesus Christ and Him crucified. And listen, our lives need to reflect it. Our lives need to reflect the love of Jesus Christ. They need to reflect not the acceptance of sin, and not the covering up of sin, and not the hiding of things. They need to reflect the idea of Jesus Christ and how He died for our sins and He forgave us. And we need to be preaching repentance and faith. We need to be preaching the forgiveness of Jesus Christ. And we need to live our life in a way that reflects that. But live our life in a way that reflects that without becoming condoning and accepting of so many things that are an abomination to the Lord Jesus Christ. All right. We are out of time, and so I'm going to have to stop there.